Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling defeated, even when you said all the right things? That strange silence in your chest, that twist in your gut, as if somehow, the more you spoke, the more power you lost. Maybe you've been in rooms filled with noise, voices that talk over you, mock your calm, dominate the air with arrogance masked as confidence. Maybe you've learned to stay quiet, to keep peace. But deep down, part of you wonders, was that weakness? Did I just surrender? You're not alone. Most people believe silence is submission, that if you don't defend yourself, you're conceding, that to be powerful, you must speak louder, push harder, fight better. But what if that belief is the very thing keeping you powerless? Nietzsche saw what few dared to admit, that the real power, the enduring kind, doesn't come from volume. It comes from presence, from restraint, from stillness so rooted, it shakes others. He believed that those who talk the most often reveal the most, that needing to prove yourself is itself a kind of defeat. The loudest person in the room is usually the weakest, not because they lack volume, but because they lack control. Our culture teaches us to react, to jump into debate, to treat every disagreement like war. But Nietzsche offers something radical. Don't play their game. Don't get pulled into the arena. Because the moment you do, the moment you feel the need to justify, to explain, to argue, you've already lost. Why? Because you've given away your power. You've shown that their opinion matters, that you need to be understood, that their validation defines your truth. Nietzsche called this herd morality, living under the invisible rule of needing to be liked, accepted, approved. It's a trap that keeps you small, polite, and ineffective. Real strength, he said, is found in not needing to speak, in watching others stumble over their need to be heard while you remain still, unbothered, observant, in choosing not to react, and letting that silence say more than any words could. Because silence, when chosen with intention, becomes a form of pressure. It destabilizes, it forces others to confront themselves, and it transforms you from a participant in their game into the one setting the rules. This isn't about passivity, it's about power. And in the next part, we'll go deeper into Nietzsche's vision of the Übermensch, the one who transcends the ordinary, dominates not by force, but by mastering their presence. You've been taught your entire life to speak up, to fight back, to make your point louder and clearer, as if truth needs volume to survive. But ask yourself, has that ever truly worked? Most people argue not to find truth, but to protect their ego. They don't listen. They wait. They wait for their turn to prove that they're right, even if it costs them the connection, even if it costs them their peace. Nietzsche saw through this. He understood that the urge to explain yourself, to defend your perspective, is rooted not in strength, but in fear. Fear of rejection, fear of not being seen, fear of losing control. And behind that fear is the ego, the fragile part of you that can't bear to be misunderstood, that confuses disagreement with disrespect, that feels shattered by silence. So it reacts, it jumps in, it fights. But every time it does, it reveals its weakness, a need to be validated by the very people it claims not to care about. This is the trap. Nietzsche believed that the greatest form of control isn't shouting, it's restraint. It's knowing you could destroy, but choosing stillness instead. That's what terrifies others. That's what makes silence so powerful. Because silence doesn't give them a script to fight. It makes them face their own. In his eyes, words are currency, and the more you spend, the cheaper they become. Real influence comes from holding back, from watching the chaos of others unfold while you remain centered. And yet, this isn't about being passive. It's not about letting others walk over you. It's about understanding that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply watches, patiently, while the rest of the world reveals itself. Because when you don't react, people reveal their cards. They expose their insecurities. They show you who they are when their performance is no longer mirrored by your attention. This is not just silence. This is strategy. You become unpredictable, unreadable, and in that, you become powerful. Not because you hold control over others, but because you no longer need anything from them. In the next part, we'll explore how silence, when used with intent, becomes more than just self-control. It becomes dominance, not over others, but over your own need to be understood. Silence is not emptiness, it's presence. And that presence, when used deliberately, can command a room without a single word. Nietzsche's Übermensch, the overman, isn't the one who dominates by shouting. He's the one who observes, understands, and chooses not to play the same tired game of ego and approval. His silence is not submission. It is superiority. It is the roar behind the stillness. When everyone else is scrambling to prove something, he proves nothing, because he needs nothing. The world is terrified of that kind of power. Why? Because silence forces others to confront themselves. When you don't react, they're left with the echo of their own words. They start doubting, questioning, projecting. Did they go too far? Did you see something they didn't mean to reveal? Your silence becomes a mirror, and many can't stand their reflection. The strongest presence in any conversation is not the one who dominates. It's the one who destabilizes without speaking, the one who doesn't blink. You're no longer fighting for validation. You're watching, strategically, attentively, for the cracks in their armor. Because when you no longer need to speak, you choose if, when, and how you respond. That choice, that control, that's the root of power. And if you've found value in this journey so far, if even one part of you has started to see silence differently, then make your next move one of quiet strength. Click subscribe, turn on notifications, not because you were convinced, but because something within you already knew. The real game isn't in what's said, it's in what's held back. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. In the next part, we'll go even deeper into the psychology behind silence. What really happens inside someone's mind when you don't respond? And why does that silence cut deeper than any insult ever could? Silence is more than the absence of sound. It is pressure. It is reflection. It is, in the most unsettling way, a confrontation, not with you, but with themselves. When you say nothing, when you do nothing, when you sit in full awareness without reaction, the other person is left alone with their words, their tone, their energy. And what happens next is rarely calm. Psychology has shown that in confrontational moments, silence is often perceived as judgment. It doesn't matter if you're neutral. The lack of verbal feedback becomes a void, one that the other person instinctively fills with anxiety, doubt, and fear. They wonder, what is he thinking? Did I say too much? Does she see through me? The mind begins spinning stories, searching for reassurance that never comes. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, activates. And suddenly they're not talking to you anymore. They're reacting to the storm inside themselves. Nietzsche didn't need modern psychology to know this. He felt it. He wrote about how silence could unmask the desperate, how those who feed on attention, manipulators, narcissists, egotists, rely on your reaction to keep their game alive. When you stay silent, their mask cracks, their script falls apart. Because they don't know what role to play anymore, the performance collapses. This is why manipulators panic in the face of stillness. They need your response. Without it, they're exposed, not to you, but to themselves. That's the power of silence. It doesn't just disarm the other. It reveals the hidden wounds they never wanted to face. But this goes deeper. Silence also awakens the unhealed parts of a person, the parts that remember being ignored, rejected, abandoned. When you withhold words, you don't just pause the conversation. You press on wounds they've buried beneath pride. And if you're not careful, if you mistake this for passivity instead of strategy, you might think you're being weak. You'll learn how to use this silence not just defensively, but offensively. Not to retreat, but to control. How to turn calm observation into your sharpest weapon. Silence is not retreat. It's positioning. It's standing still, not because you are passive, but because you are preparing, measuring, listening with the kind of attention that unnerves. And Nietzsche knew this. Those who master silence don't disappear from the battlefield. They reshape it. Silence, when used with intention, becomes a multi-layered weapon. The first layer is resistance, not reacting when provoked, not rising to every challenge, not taking the bait, because the moment you react, you step into their narrative. You fight by their rules, and the more you fight, the more predictable you become. The second layer is observation. While they speak, explain, defend, you collect. Every insecurity masked by arrogance, every contradiction buried under noise. You're not just listening, you're scanning, dissecting, preparing to strike, not with volume, but with precision. The third layer, timing. Most people fear silence because they don't understand how to hold it. But the longer the pause, the more pressure builds. Your silence becomes a question mark, a judgment, a mystery. And people fear what they can't read. That's the difference between noise and impact. A single sentence delivered after 5 seconds of stillness carries more weight than a speech shouted in desperation. It lands like a hammer, not because it was loud, but because it was earned. The fourth layer, unpredictability. When you master silence, you stop being easy to read. You become a question that no one can answer. People start choosing their words more carefully around you. They hesitate, they calculate, because they don't know what silence might be hiding, or what it might reveal. And that makes you dangerous. Not violent, not cruel, but sovereign, free from the compulsions that govern the herd, unbound by the need to be liked, understood, or justified. But remember, this silence is not passivity. It is tension, controlled, directed, honed tension. It's not about holding back forever. It's about choosing when to strike. And when you do, it's surgical, minimal, devastating.
In the final part, we'll confront the darker side of silence, because sometimes silence isn't power. Sometimes it's submission in disguise. And if you don't recognize the difference, you might think you're in control, when in fact, you're being used. Not all silence is power. There is problem.
Sometimes silence is surrender in disguise. And if you're not careful, the same stillness that once protected you begins to consume you. There's a difference between strategic silence and conditioned silence. One is a weapon, the other is a cage. One is chosen, the other is inherited from years of shrinking, avoiding, submitting. And Nietzsche saw this. He saw that many people confuse peace with passivity. They tell themselves they're being mature, calm, collected, but in truth, they've been trained to stay silent not from wisdom, but from fear. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being seen. And so they give up their space in conversations. They let others speak over them, for them, against them. They convince themselves it's not worth it, that letting it go is the high road, but what they're really doing is disappearing. You've seen this. Maybe you've lived this. You bite your tongue, you keep the peace, but the cost is you. And Nietzsche warned against this herd morality, the quiet resignation disguised as virtue. He didn't write for the compliant. He wrote for those who were ready to destroy the parts of themselves that were built to please others. Because real silence, the silence of the Übermensch, isn't quiet because it's scared. It's quiet because it no longer needs to speak to exist. It is a silence that takes up space, a silence that commands presence, a silence that says, I am here, and I do not need to explain myself to anyone. That's the silence Nietzsche respected, the kind that ends conversations before they begin, the kind that creates gravity, not emptiness. So now ask yourself, are you quiet because you choose power, or because you were trained not to disturb? It's time to make a choice. The world is full of voices, but what it lacks, desperately, is presence. Let your silence become that presence, not a void, a boundary, not an escape, a declaration. And if you've made it this far, comment below. What kind of silence have you been carrying, and what kind are you ready to claim? Because the silence that shapes the world doesn't wait for permission.